and then once the go live is active, we should be able to now pull up chat on this one. Hi, come on, pull up chat. Pulled up the chat. There we go. Now we can open that one up, and we can now see the chat going that side, and we can see my screen and stream info going this side, which is so nice. And we can also open up this one, which should give us all the general information and stuff that we need. Nice, there you go. I can see all my stuff. Cool. Hey, good evening everybody. Hope you guys are doing quite well. This evening we'll be covering the basics: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. 3 things that some people do sometimes forget to pay attention to, especially if you're starting out with photography and it's the first time you're starting to use manual mode, especially on your camera. So it is important that you do understand what these 3 settings do on your camera, as well as how these 3 settings affect your overall exposure on your camera itself. So as an example, we've got 3 settings that we can change on a camera to control exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So what we'll do is we will start with shutter speed first, because shutter speed is one of the very important ones, because that allows you to either show motion or freeze motion. Now, why is it important that you know how your shutter speed works? Well, as an example, if you take photos of people, which will be portraits or lifestyle type photos, you always want your shutter speed to be at around 1/125, which is more or less the center of our little shutter speed picture that we've got on screen currently. Now, what a shutter speed of 125 does is it allows you to remove camera shake, as well as it's a very pleasing shutter speed to use when you're starting to do portraits more, because you want to freeze the motion, you want to freeze your subject, you want to make sure that you can get your subject nice and sorted out. Now, you might also ask yourself, but Andrew, why would I want to use a shutter speed of 60 or 1 second or 10 seconds or something as such as well? Because you can use those, but those are more for your landscape style photos. As an example, if you've got running water and you want to show motion in your water as well, then you would use a slower shutter speed, like 1/15 on the shutter, up to a second, sometimes even 10 seconds on your shutter speed, because that would show much more motion, which helps you get that milky effect on your water. Now let's say you're shooting sport. Now on sport you want a fast shutter speed, something like 1,400 or 2,000 or even 4,000 on your shutter speed. Now the reason you want that is because you've got many fast moving things. Your subjects move quite fast, they run around, they do a lot of stuff, and that means that you do require a faster shutter speed to freeze that motion. Because as an example, if you've got a rugby player running across the field quite fast, sprinting, and you use 1/125 on your shutter, then you will have a lot of motion in that photo still, due to the fact that he's moving so fast that you do require a faster shutter speed. Something like 1/400 would help you freeze some sport stuff, but if you've got the really fast moving action type sport stuff, then you would require a shutter speed of at least 1,000 and upwards. So shutter speed is your control point on your camera, where you control, do you want to freeze the action? Do you want to show the motion of the action? So it's very important that you decide on your shutter speed and what you want to show, because you control the motion in your photos. So you need to be aware that your shutter speed affects the motion in the photos quite a lot. You can use a faster shutter speed to freeze motion, but on the negative side, this will also darken down your entire scene. So as an example, 1,000 on your shutter will darken your scene quite a bit. Hey Wesley dude, thank you for joining. So 1,000 on your shutter speed would be a very dark scene, because it will bring down your overall exposure, because shutter speed does also affect your exposure. Whereas if you go to 2 seconds on your exposure, it's going to be very bright, because your shutter will be open for 2 seconds before it takes the photo. So that's 2 seconds of gathering light, which means it will be very overexposed. So you need to decide, do you want to freeze motion, yes or no? How much of that motion do you want to freeze, or how much of that motion do you want to show? Because that will affect the way that you handle your shutter speed. Shutter speed is just one of your control points. A faster shutter speed freezes motion, darkens down your entire scene. A slower shutter speed shows motion, adds more light to your scene. So decide which one you want. I would normally say start at 1/125 on your shutter for portraits and work from there. If you're outdoors shooting in the midday sun or in a very bright location, you might want to increase your shutter speed to darken down the scene. As an example, 1/125 for portraits where I'm sitting is perfect. But as soon as I go 400 on the shutter where I'm sitting now, the entire scene will be way too dark for a portrait photo. But if I'm standing outside in the shade, then 1/400 on your shutter speed might be more appropriate compared to using 1/125 on your shutter speed. So it's all a bit of practice and play to see where your shutter speed fits in perfectly to allow you to correctly expose for your scene, because it is an exposure point for us that we can control. Now, apart from your shutter speed, we also have a lovely control point called our aperture. Now, aperture is something that is very cool and fun to play with. So aperture has two effects on your photos. It will either add light or reduce light to your scene due to the fact that it controls your global exposure, or it will also affect how much is in focus or how much is out of focus. As an example, this photo or this video is being recorded at f1.4, which is a very shallow depth of field, which means that if I do this, that everything behind me goes into out of focus. And I'm back in focus. There you go. So keep in mind that your shutter or your aperture that you select will also determine how much you have in focus. So as an example, if you're shooting a portrait, f1.4 might not be adequate to shoot a portrait with, because if you focus on my eye at f1.4, you take that photo, maybe my eye's in focus, but my nose is not going to be in focus. So I can do it like this, and this is at f1.4. So if I come a little bit closer, so where you can see me, like that, and now you will see that my eye is in focus, but my ear is out of focus. And this is because I'm shooting at f1.4. Now f1.4 also allows you to add a lot of light, so it's good for low light, but it's not the best to get nice sharp portraits. For that you want to stop down to either f2.8, which will add to how much is in focus. Because remember, at f1.4 you might have only this much in focus. At f2.8 you might have this much in focus. So at f2.8, if you have that much in focus, that basically covers my entire face, or your entire subject face, which means if you're taking portraits and things as such, then f2.8 would be a much sharper aperture to use for taking portraits compared to f1.4. Now f1.4 is still a really good aperture to use for portraits in a creative way. As an example with this video, if I want to go close, let's change to my face. If I want to go close for a closer portrait or headshot as such, and I want to blur out the background, I would use f1.4. But I'm not going to be sharp. That's just one of those things, because most lenses get sharper when you stop them down. So even your kit lens, which starts at f3.5, will get sharper when you start to step down to f5.6 or f8. But as soon as you go over f11 on your lens, you will start to run into something that is called diffraction. Now what diffraction does is, sure, you've got more in focus, but because you've got more in focus, hey Kelvin dude, it is always happy to help. So when you do shoot at something like f22 as an example, you will have a very, very, very large depth of field to work with. A lot will be in focus, but you will run into diffraction. So diffraction softens down your image again. So instead of your image actually getting sharper, it will now do the reverse, where yes, you've got more in focus, but what is in focus isn't sharp, or it starts to degrade your image quality. So for most lenses ever made, f5.6 to f8 is your sweet spot. If you're doing portraits, f2, f2.8, perfectly fine for portraits. f5.6 even better, because it'll be sharp as hell. So when it comes to aperture, you can control how much is in focus, how much is out of focus, as well as you can now control your depth. So as an example, if we're taking a landscape photo, we want to be shooting at f8 because that will allow more in focus. if we take a landscape photo at f1.4, it's not going to be very sharp, because yes, we can still take that picture at f1.4, but it's not going to allow us enough depth for our scene, because Aperture allows us to either show the scene, stuff behind us, or not show the scene, using f1.4 as an example, or f1.8 on your lens. So it all depends on how much you want in focus, how much you want out of focus. Now also keep in mind, f1.4 is bright, really good for low light. f8 is not very bright, it's not good for low light. So if you're shooting a low light, you want to shoot your 50mm f1.8 lens at f1.8. Yes, your pictures will be a little bit softer, so not as sharp as they can be, but the added light will allow you to get more keeper photos when you're shooting in low light conditions. When you go outside and you're shooting portraits outside or running around chasing children around, then f1.8 might not be the correct aperture to use because of the bright sun. And now you're shooting at f1.8 as an example, which lets in a very large amount of light. That means you need to crank up that shutter speed all the way up, and you might still not even be able to correctly expose your scene due to the fact that f1.8 does allow a lot of light to reach your sensor. So instead, if you go outside, you might want to stop down to f4, 5.6, f8, around those areas. Normally if you shoot wide open, it would be much better advisable to move your subject to some shade, because that would allow you to correctly expose in the shade, which is a little bit lower light outside, but you still get a bunch of good light. So Aperture controls your depth in your scene. f1.4 will give you about this much, f2.8 will give you about that much, and f4 will give you about that much, which is in focus. So decide how much you want in focus. And then also keep in mind, when you shoot at f1.4, you will allow a lot of light into the camera, but when you shoot at f8, you're not going to be allowing a lot of light into your camera, so you might need to compensate in other places. So keep in mind that Aperture controls your depth as well as your overall scene exposure. If you want to darken down your scene, you can drop your aperture. This scene currently is at f1.4. I can darken it down by changing my lens to f4. So see, now I've changed my lens from f1.4 to f4, which means now I'm darker, because we've now changed the aperture, which will darken down our entire scene. So now that I know I'm working in a low light scene, I can now raise my aperture, as an example, to f1.4 to get my correct exposure. There you go, f1.4. So as you can see, your aperture controls your overall exposure in your entire scene, which means your aperture will have a very large effect in your scene. So you need to decide what you're going to do with your aperture when you're shooting. So that's now covered our aperture, that's covered our shutter speed as well. The next thing we need to cover is ISO. So ISO is the fun one, because ISO you can do a lot of cool stuff with. So for most cameras, your lowest ISO setting will be ISO 100. Now ISO 100 will give you very sharp results, very clean results as well, because at ISO 100 you don't have a lot of noise or a lot of grain on your photos at all. But as soon as you start to go up in your ISO, as an example, ISO 800, ISO 3200, ISO 12800, the higher you go in your ISO, the more noise and the more grain you will add to your photos, which is a little bit of a problem, because the more noise and stuff you add to your photos, the less quality you have on your photos overall, simply due to the fact that you are now reducing or adding on to your light. Let me just scroll down here. I made some notes in that regard now to help. There you go. So as an example, if we are shooting portraits outside when the sun is shining, we want to be shooting at ISO 100. Why? Because that will give us nice clean photos. There is no reason to shoot at ISO 1600 outside in the midday sun. If you're shooting at that high of an ISO, your settings are not correct, and you need to go back and check your aperture and check your shutter speed. because sometimes you can just simply drop your aperture a little bit, drop your shutter speed a bit, so you can reduce your ISO and you can get nice clean photos. Now on the flip side, if you're doing a wedding event and it's a very low light type of wedding event, you might need to boost up your ISO to compensate correctly. So our shutter speed will always be for portraits 1/125, because that allows us to capture nice portraits, and it also removes camera shake and things like that, and it helps us freeze the motion just enough for portraits, which is perfect. But now let's say you're shooting portraits indoors at that shutter speed. You now need to suddenly shoot at ISO 400, maybe ISO 800, which is still fine because it will still give you decent photos. Yes, they will be a little bit more grainy, but due to the fact that we correctly set our shutter speed and we are now boosting our ISO, we will have grainy photos, but they will be sharp in focus photos without motion blur, which is much better than not having any photos at all. So keep in mind that when you do go into lower light conditions and you need to start boosting your ISO, that yes, keep in mind you do not want to go below a certain amount of shutter speed, for the simple fact that as soon as you go too much down on your shutter speed, then things will start to show too much motion, which will destroy your entire event, unfortunately. So some general guidelines in regards to ISO and what type of ISO values would work for which types of scenes. Outdoors, midday sun or in the shade, ISO 100 to ISO 200, perfect. Gives you nice clean results. You've got more than enough light in your scene to work with, so it should not be a problem at all to use ISO 100, ISO 200 in outdoors environments. Perfectly easy to do. Now once you start to move indoors, now things become tricky, because depending on the light indoors, you might now need to boost your ISO to 400 to maybe 800, and that will be your max range for going into an indoor area which still has a good bit of light, because now you need to compensate with your ISO to get your scene set up correctly. Now when you start to go into much lower light conditions, you might now need to start shooting at ISO 1600 all the way up to ISO 3200. Normally those ranges are good for lower light conditions, but then you start to see a lot of noise and a lot of grain in your photos. But remember, having a grainy, noisy photo compared to having a photo that is out of focus is still better. So yes, ISO will add noise, it will add grain to your photos, which is fine as long as you're able to get the photo. That is important. You need to be sure that you set your ISO appropriately for the area that you shoot in. Now let's say you go from a low light condition area to a extremely low light condition area. So that would be a area where they only have like small Christmas lights and stuff like that going on. Now you're starting to get into the ISO 6400 and up range. Now at ISO 6400 and up, you will start to run into a lot of problems when it comes to your grain and quality overall on your photos, because at those higher ISO values, not only do you start to get a lot of grain, but it degrades your overall image quality a lot. So in those conditions, just to always explain to your client that this is extremely low light, there's not much you can do. You are going to shoot photos, but they must just keep in mind that these photos will not be at their best, simply for the fact that there's no light and you can't see in the dark with your camera. It's just one of those things. You need to be aware that your ISO has this effect on it. So ISO affects your noise and your grain in your photos, as well as it affects your overall exposure. So as an example, this video is being recorded at ISO 100. So my scene is very well exposed at ISO 100. But if I now change my ISO from ISO 100 all the way to, I think that's the way, or was it the other way? Let's change the dial. There we go. Cool. So now we're at ISO 800. Now, as you can see, ISO 800 is very bright and overexposed for our current scene. As well as our image quality has started to degrade, we can also turn down the power on our light to compensate for it. But now, even though we are correctly exposed, we'll now start to run into other weird artifacts and problems and things as such as well. So even at my current settings, which is ISO 800 to 1600, I believe, we're still getting a decent picture quality. but it will start to degrade. And remember, we're also adding a light, so it's a little bit different. So let's add our light back up. There we go. Let's drop our ISO back down. There you go. Now I'm properly exposed again. Perfect. There you go. Nice. Now, move my chair closer. There you go. So as you can see, your ISO has a global effect on your photos as well. The same as your aperture, the same as your shutter speed. Both of these three settings, or all three of these settings, will affect your entire scene. With shutter speed affecting your motion, and aperture affecting how much is in focus, as an example, and ISO affecting your noise levels and or blurriness, not blurriness, just noise overall, which will degrade quality quite badly. So in all three of those cases, hey, sweet, thanks dude, no problems at all. So in all three of these cases, you always want to expose your scene properly. Now, what I mean by exposing your scene properly is, when you go to your scene and you know you're going to be taking portraits, you want to start with your shutter speed first when you're shooting manual, and you want to set your shutter speed to your correct shutter speed to freeze motion. So this would be a starting shutter speed of 125. Once you've set your shutter speed for portraits, we want to now set our lens. So how much do we want in focus for portraits? Do we want to show the environment? Do we want to have separation from the environment? If you're using a 50mm f1.8 lens, this means you now need to select, do you want to shoot at f1.8, get a little bit softer photos but have a lot of out of focus background, or do you want to stop it down to f2.8, get more of your subject in focus and get a little bit less background blur, but your photos will be sharper. That's the nice trade-off, because once you start to stop your lens down, you start to sharpen things up a bit, which is nice. So first we select our shutter speed. To start with, 1/125 on the shutter. We select f4 on our lens for portraits. Now we need to select our ISO. Are we outside where it's nice and bright? If yes, set ISO to 100. If no, you're working in the shade, keep it at 100, but if it's a little bit too dark, raise it to 2, maybe 3, maybe 400 as well, just to compensate appropriately for it. If you're going to indoors portraits, you might want to open up your lens to f2.8 if you're using a 50mm lens, and set your ISO to ISO 800. Yes, you will start to get a little bit of noise, but your photos will still be sharp and will still be in focus. That's the important bit. So from here we will then adjust accordingly. So let's say we've set our ISO to 100 for our scene. We've selected f4 on our lens, and we have 1/125 on our shutter speed. When we take a test photo on our scene with our subject inside the shade outdoors, it's overexposed. So what do? Well, it's overexposed, so we need to change the setting. First setting we will change is our shutter speed. We will now raise our shutter speed. Now the reason we want to raise our shutter speed is, we've already set our lens to f4, which will give us nice and sharp photos. We've already set our ISO to ISO 100, which will give us nice and clean photos. So the setting we get to change and play with will be our shutter speed. We will now raise our shutter speed from 125 to 400, maybe 1000 for in the shade, till we get a correct exposure. This is very important. If, and this is the other if we're on the opposite side and we're working with our subject inside the shade, we've got our shutter speed set to 1/125, our lens at f4, our ISO at ISO 100, and we take a test photo in the shade and it's too dark. Well, now we've got a choice of two things we can change. We can change either our aperture or our ISO. Remember, we do not want to drop our shutter speed below 125. So if our scene is too dark, we cannot drop our shutter speed to compensate for it, because we will introduce motion blur to our photos. We do not want that. So instead what we're going to do is, we're either going to open up our lens from f4 to f2.8 if your lens can achieve it, but if your lens cannot go wider than f4 on the aperture, we now need to raise our ISO to compensate accordingly. In the shade outdoor, if f4 with 125 on shutter doesn't give you a good exposure and it's a bit too dark, ISO 400, ISO 800 would normally do the trick for me, so it should work just fine for you as well. But keep in mind, due to the fact that we want our shutter speed to always be at 1/125 for portraits or higher, that's one of our main control points when we want to darken down our scene. If we want to lighten our scene, we want to move either to our aperture or our ISO and adjust those accordingly. But this all would be different depending on the lens that you use, the quality of the lens, and the camera body and the sensor that you use as well. As an example, on my camera, this f1.4 lens is sharp at f1.4, so I can shoot it wide open and still get sharp results, which is different compared to, as an example, a 50mm f1.8 lens. A 50mm f1.8 lens costs about an eighth of what this lens costs. So the build quality will not be the same, the image quality will not be the same as well. So if you shoot a cheaper f1.8 50mm lens at f1.8, be aware that they will not give you the sharpest results. You will need to start to stop down your aperture to f2.8 and then normally gets really nice and sharp, or f4 to get really nice and sharp photos on that 50mm f1.8 lens. Because remember, your 50mm f1.8 lens is a budget-friendly low-light lens, which also gives you nice control over your background, but due to the fact that it is a budget-friendly lens, you do not get the sharpest photos wide open. So it will be different compared to, hey Shrundu, nice seeing you as well. So it will be different compared to if I used a 50mm f1.8 lens versus, as an example, a 50mm f1.4 lens like this one, because this lens was designed to be sharp at f1.8, which is completely different from a 50mm f1.8 cheaper lens. Why didn't I tell you I was going live? Because this is part of my photography 101 thing that I want to start. So this will be covering all the basics: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, which is important. So keep in mind that when you choose your lens that you want to work with, if you use a cheaper lens, which is your kit lens, or the 50mm f1.8 lens, or the 70-300 lens, which a lot of people use as well, those lenses you want to aim for sharpness, and you can get sharpness from f4 to about f8. That's where those lenses perform their best. Once you use those lenses at that aperture, you will start to see that yes, it will darken down your scene, but in return you will get sharper results as well. So keep that in mind, that when you do set up your scene, and if you are using a kit lens, there's nothing wrong with a kit lens. 90% of my own portfolio was shot with a kit lens. There's nothing wrong with them at all. You just need to remember and keep in mind that when you do use your kit lens, you need to use the appropriate aperture to get sharp results. A kit lens shot wide open at f3.5, it will be sharp, but it will get much sharper once you sort of stop it down to f5.6 as an example. So the main thing you need to do is you need to pick up your camera and you need to go and test it. So take your camera, test your shutter speed, get a family member to stand still, take a photo at 1/125, take a photo at 1/15, take a photo at 1/400. See how they differ. Also get your subject to move, take a photo again, and change your shutter speed and see how your shutter speed changes affect the motion of the movement on your subject. From here, you also want to then test the aperture on your lens. Take a photo with your lens wide open, and then once you've taken a photo of your lens wide open, stop it down to f5.6, take another photo at f8, take another photo at f16. Take all of those photos into your photo editing application, zoom in and check the sharpness level between all of those photos. Notice where it will be the sharpest would be between f5.6 to f8, but just keep that in mind that when you do use this lens that you're testing with your subject and you want the sharpest results possible, this is why we test. Because once you've tested and you know which aperture would be the sharpest on your lens, then you know moving forward that yes, I need to shoot my scene at f5.6 because I want sharp as hell photos, or I want to sacrifice sharpness to have more background blur. These are all decisions that you need to make. Then the last thing you need to test on your camera is your ISO values. Shoot a photo at ISO 100, shoot a photo at ISO 400, shoot a photo at ISO 800, and keep going up all the way to your maximum ISO. Pull all of those files into your editing photo application, Photoshop or whichever, and check your noise levels between all of your ISO values. Find the ISO value which you decide is your maximum ISO value that you are happy with shooting for a client. So what this means is, if I shoot at ISO 3200 on my camera, I am happy to deliver those photos to my clients because they will not be as noisy as higher ISO values, but I know that at ISO 3200 I'm still getting relatively clean results which my clients will be happy with. But due to the fact that I did test my camera, I will never shoot at ISO 6400 or ISO 12800 because my image quality will degrade way too much, to the point where I would not be happy to give those photos to my clients. So you need to test this on your camera, because every camera made, every sensor made, every processor inside your camera handles ISO and noise levels differently. So you need to take your camera, take a family member, test your shutter speed. You need to take your camera, take a family member, test your aperture, see where your lens is sharp. You need to take your camera, you need to take a family member or a can of Coke, test your ISO values and find the cleanest ISO that your camera can shoot at, normally ISO 100, and find your maximum ISO that you are happy with shooting for a client. Keep all of these settings in mind when you go out to do your shoots, and apply what you've learned from your gear to your shoots to get nice, sharp, clean photos with nice frozen motion for your subjects. So you can get nice, in focus, sharp and clean photos. This is very important because you need to study your gear, you need to know what your gear does, because my camera at ISO 3200 will do completely different compared to your camera at ISO 3200. Yes, that is correct, my friends. That is where photography begins, with the basics, because a lot of people skip the basics, which is one of those things. So you need to keep in mind that you need to test your gear. You need to understand how your gear performs under certain lighting conditions. You need to understand how your gear performs when you change your settings, because it's important that you know that if you're shooting sports, you need to up your shutter speed. If you're shooting in shade and you need to add a little bit of ISO, you need to know what your maximum ISO would be where you're happy with shooting, because these are all things that you need to know about your gear. You can't use my settings or settings that Sharon might use on his camera, or settings that anybody else uses on their camera on your camera and expect to get the same results, because we all use different cameras. We use different lenses, we have different sensors inside our cameras. I'm currently using a Fujifilm X-T5 with a 40 megapixel APS-C sensor with a very high-end lens on it, which means that my settings on your camera will not have the same performance. Vice versa. If I set my camera up to shoot at the same settings that you're using, I will not get the same results. My results will be completely different as well, because cameras handle things differently, and you need to study what your camera does, because only you know where you're going to be using your camera and how you need to be setting up your camera to get the best results possible, because you need to tell the camera what the camera needs to do. The camera doesn't do stuff by itself. You're the photographer. You're in charge of making sure to get nice, clean, sharp, decent photos. And it's just one of those things you need to make sure that you take the time, take a day, take a half day, take how much time ever you require, and test. Make sure you understand how your gear works. Make sure you understand how to get the best out of your gear, because a lot of people, what they do is they have a Canon 4000D with a kit lens, and they think, I need to buy a new camera because my camera doesn't give good results. Nah, camera can give good results. It can give amazing results, as long as you know how to get those amazing results from your gear. So you need to go practice, and practice is key, because practice makes perfect. It's just one of those things. But yes, that should cover all the basics in regards to shutter speed, aperture and ISO for us. And I want you now to go out, practice what I've shared with you in this short little video in regards to your ISO, shutter speed and aperture. Test it and just see for yourself the results you can get, and make note of the results that you get as well, because you need to know how your gear works. But anyway, it was just me doing a close to midnight random little video again. This will be added onto a playlist for Photography 101. This will be the beginner's guide, in other words, how to know what your three main settings on your camera do. The next one we'll do tomorrow or whenever to cover the following steps with the photography basics, and we'll just keep building and building and building till we've assembled an entire short small photography course which can take anybody with a camera from auto to manual and getting good results. So if you find this information handy and or good and or fun to just listen to me ramble on, drop it a like, drop it a share with your friends that might need some assistance with their own photography and stuff. And always remember, if you do have any questions, either drop them down below, drop me inbox. My inbox is extremely full at the moment. I've got 800 and something inboxes. I'm trying to get to everybody. Unfortunately, it does take a bit of time. But yes, practice, expand your own knowledge, learn your gear, trust your gear. Do not buy new gear hoping to get new results if you're not even able to get good results with your current gear. Practice, my dudes, practice. It's the way things work. But anyway, I'm gonna go make coffee, start my prep work on our next Photography 101 course, which will cover a little bit more advanced things as well, maybe some advanced techniques and such. But yes, hopefully this information was useful to you, and I will now go grab my coffee, have some fun, and hopefully catch you guys again soon with our next installment of our Photography 101 sessions. This one was just the basics. A lot of you people forget about the basics. I forget about the basics sometimes. It's just the way things work and the way things happen. But hopefully together we can grow the community, we can grow our skills, and we can all start to achieve nice, sharp, clean results with the gear that we have. So I hope this was awesome. Keep well, my dudes. Keep safe. Catch you guys real soon again. Let's see what we can do. Have fun.